Hello, everyone, and this is Professor Castleberry, and this is our first philosophical lecture short for our Ethics 220 asynchronous class. Um, you'll see the rest of the videos will actually, most of them will be me with a whiteboard behind me teaching class. But those I did a few years ago, already had them done, but I didn't really have a new kind of introduction to philosophy for ethics for this online course. So I wanted to go ahead and just give you one with me sitting here and just talking to you. Another thing to mention, this is also on YouTube, so other people might be checking this out that aren't from my class, but this is specifically as an intro for my class. Okay, now Ethics 220, before we even get into it, we have to realize ethics is part of philosophy. It's a branch of philosophy. So the first thing we really need to talk about is, what is philosophy? And if I was in a normal class, I'd go up there and write on the board and go, what is philosophy? And then I would turn to you and ask. And we'd go and people would give their opinions. Some people would be like, I have no idea. Eventually, though, what would happen is I would begin turning to discussing classical concepts of what it means to be what philosophy means. And the first person I would talk about would be Socrates, who died in 399 BC. So he was born around 470, died 399. So we're talking 2,400, 2,500 years ago, a long time ago. Socrates considered philosophy quite literally. He took it for what the actual terms meant, which come from two Greek terms, philia and sophia. Philia means love as a sense of like friendship, like a brotherly love type of thing, right? And sophia is the word for wisdom. So what philosophy means is the love or friendship of wisdom. And philosophers quite literally are lovers of wisdom. And so the next question we would ask is, well, what is wisdom? And we'd go around, people would ask about that, and eventually someone would probably say, well, wisdom is a type of knowledge. And I think that is accurate. Wisdom at least includes knowledge. But we would quickly point out there's a lot of people who know things that we might say aren't very wise. For example, you could go to school and study business, study all the things about it, but that's a lot different from being in the real world and managing a business, living the business. And so the next topic or next idea would come out, well, maybe you need experience. Wisdom is knowledge with experience. This is something like Aristotle believed, all right, that you have to experience the world as well, know how to apply it, okay, in order to really be wise about it. Knowledge plus experience equals wisdom. And Aristotle was one who thought the older you were, the more wise you were, because the more experience you had. Now there are other thinkers who have challenged that idea. One person I always think of when talking about Aristotle is the English poet William Blake, who claimed that there is a wisdom to age, but as you age, you become more structured, more rational in your thinking, and you're not really open-minded anymore. And there's a type of wisdom that comes with youth, this kind of open to possibilities, open to this way or that way, there is a wisdom in itself. And so what exactly is wisdom? It's not necessarily just knowledge experience. It could be something else. And one thing we'll see is it's debatable. And that's the first thing I think we're going to see in any philosophy course, ethics or any other, is that these things are debatable. They're questionable. In fact, what's interesting enough is the field of philosophy itself is also in question. Philosophers, we don't even agree on what philosophy is. We argue it. So it's a very interesting field. There's very little, generally when you get into science class, they agree with sciences. We might have different type of scientists, different studies they have, but they all agree on here are the methods we're using. Philosophy is not like that. We don't even agree on the methods we use. So there's going to be a lot of difference of an opinion in this. Then we can move to someone like Aristotle, who had a different idea of philosophy. He says philosophy was an attempt to get at the things in themselves, that we need to understand the world or the things that are out there in themselves by themselves. Now, that sounds a very strange concept, but what all he means is that we need to understand reality without opinion, without bias, without our own subjective kind of way of perceiving it. Take the human being out the way. And this is a very popular idea in philosophy, the history of Western philosophy. Get us out the way so we can understand what is as itself. Now, other people might challenge that. Is that, can you even do that? What is the world, without our perceptions? We're always trapped in our perceptions, we might say. And they might challenge Aristotle, which that's totally okay. But then you might meet philosophers in the 20th century, someone like Martin Heidegger, who believes you can get at the things themselves. It's just the things themselves, all right, include our perceptions with it. So the things themselves are and somehow tied with our subjectivity. At least that is what, a position we could take as well. Is that correct? Not sure. All right. But right now, if you're a little like, what is going on? It's okay. We're just kind of throwing you into the middle and see if you can swim or not right now. There's also someone we could say, like go to the 20th century here, and I could think of, let's see, here you go, like the philosopher Gilles Deleuze, the French philosopher. Um, he claims that philosophy is the art or the history of concept making. Is that what philosophy does is we create new ways of thinking about the world, which then generate new concepts, new ways of thinking, right? And each period of philosophy you'll see is different philosophers are kind of creating their own conceptual world. And once we understand that conceptual world, the world kind of, it gets enframed and becomes a picture. It becomes clear. It's like, oh, once we take this perspective, we see how the world looks this way. And it's the history of concept making, of new ways and new truths, new ways to understand the world. And it keeps kind of developing and developing. It's not necessarily progressive, going towards some endpoint. It's just new ways of understanding the world seem to work. Now, that's a very controversial way of looking at it, but all I'm trying to point out now is there's these very different ways of approaching philosophy and what it is. Now, if I had an intro class and was going to, like, just say, hey, here's an intro class that I have, and here's what I think philosophy is, my definition would be that philosophy is an attempt to gain an understanding of existence as a whole. Now, and then if I would add to that, it's an attempt to gain an understanding of existence as a whole by use of reason. Okay, now, there's a lot of words there, but first, let me just take the main words, like existence. And what I mean by existence, I mean being, this thing that we're in. This, the thing that's happening, it's been happening since you were born. It's going on right now. If we were in a classroom, it'd be happening there. It will keep happening until you die. It may happen after. It may not. I don't know. All right? That thing that's happening, there's something going on, that thing. Now, you may say, you mean physical world? You mean spiritual world, whatever? No, I don't want to say anything like that yet, because the first thing I want to point out is this thing we're talking about, we don't want to assume anything about it, because once we assume, all right, we may make mistakes. For example, if I were to assume it was the physical world, that's what I'm talking about. Well, right away I cut off ideas of spirituality, or perhaps the idea of mental worlds, or of perception, or other things that could be there. And so a philosopher, when we kind of approach the thing that we're talking about, being, existence, we don't want to assume anything yet. We just want to say, this thing that's happening, I want to know about it. And what I want to know about it, I want to know it as a whole. And what I mean as a whole, I want to know it in its totality. What does it mean in the end-all, be-all? What is it in itself? What does it mean? Now, some may say that's impossible. There's no way to understand what this whole thing is. Maybe you're right. Maybe that's an impossible task. That's why we say it's an attempt. Some philosophers say we're just going to go as deep down the rabbit hole as we can, and we'll keep going. Maybe it's a never ending. Perhaps there is this thing called, it's a mystery, and it should always be that way, but we can keep entering the mystery. Others will say, well, the fact that you can claim that existence is a thing that can never be completely understood as a whole, well, just by saying that, you are giving it a meaning as a whole. You're saying this thing that we live in as a whole can never be understood. And that really even brings up this mystery idea again that I like to talk about, is that what you're saying is the universe, or excuse me, the existence is something which never can be understood and will always remain mysterious. Well, you've just given it a meaning as a whole. As a whole, it's a mystery. And that's something that's really fun to think about. Some philosophers think you can achieve this, that we can discover what the meaning is. Others think it's not. It's more of like almost like Gilles Deleuze's idea, this is a constant thing we're doing. It's not necessarily progression, but something we can almost, we can keep entering into, and we just get more interpretation and more interpretation. If you get a chance, take a look at this thing called the hermeneutical circle, which is the idea that as the existence becomes interpreted, it only opens itself to new interpretations. It doesn't close interpretation. It opens up new questions. And I really like that idea of philosophy. Not saying it's the right one, all right? But I do like that one. And then we say by use of reason. It's the last part. Now, reason is can be debated on what it is, but all we mean in the sense of reason, okay, is thinking critically, all right? Is not allowing for basically the idea of contradiction. That if I claim something is one thing, okay, it is, altogether this is what it is, then it can't be this other thing. For example, if I say the piece of chalk is all white, well, that would mean logically, rationally, it can't be all black at the same time. Now I can have a white piece of chalk, a black piece of chalk. I have a piece of chalk that's white, then black, then white, then black. But try to even imagine the idea, okay, that one piece of chalk is both white and black completely at the same time. And I don't mean gray. So you can close your eyes and think about it. Try to do it in your mind. You can make the picture switch back and forth. You can make two images, one color, one another, but you cannot make that piece of chalk one color and another color completely at the same time. That would be a logical contradiction. You would be breaking reasoning if you said that. So basically what we're talking about with using reasoning is by being logical, being critical, okay? Now, this has been debated. What can be said rationally or not is also debatable in philosophy, so I don't want to necessarily say that, like, oh, that's the end of the story. But if you ever get a chance to take my logic class, we talk a lot about reasoning. If you take a chance to take my 101 class, we talk a lot about logic and reasoning as well, and the problems with it, and also the upside for it. But in philosophy, that is the tool we use. Where someone like religion uses divine revelation, where myth uses story without divine revelation. They just claim a story, whereas religion, their proof is divine revelation, where someone says, hey, I spoke to God. This is the truth. And then science, which is kind of the brother or sister or cousin of philosophy, they definitely use reason too, but science can only talk about what's observable. Now, philosophers, we talk about what's observable too, but we can talk about other concepts that are not observable, like, first of all, what it means to be observable. Philosophy would talk about, is there something that happens to you after you die? What is the meaning of existence? What is knowledge, right? What is rationality? What is the physical? What is God? Do you have free will or not? There's all these questions that we'll see that science can help, but are not necessarily in the scope of science. Once we begin getting into things that are just no longer just the observable, once we begin doing that, and using reasoning, now you're starting to do philosophy. Now, if you want to get a chance to take a look at some of my other lectures, especially my Intro to Philosophy, What is Philosophy lecture on YouTube from a couple years ago, it's in a couple pieces. I'll put it in our module here for eventually too here, so you guys can check it out. It's not going to be mandatory, but if you want to look at that, I get way more into what philosophy is. I talk more about everything I just mentioned in this, and a lot longer, with a little less, with more detail. So if you want to check it out, go ahead. But I want to jump to ethics now. Now, ethics is a branch of philosophy, okay? Now, there are 5, some say 4. I'm going to put it as 5 major branches of philosophy. So let me just tell you what those are, and then we'll dive into ethics, and that'll be it for this video. So the 5 major branches of philosophy are metaphysics, which are the boundaries of existence, what can be and what cannot be. 2 examples of metaphysical philosophies would be if you believe in God, that God is the creator of everything, and he is the end-all, be-all. Well, that means you just answered what can be and not be. What can be is what God says can be. And you would ask then, was there anything outside of God? Well, no, because God is existence. So that is a metaphysical idea. But then you could have something like the physicalist, which is also a metaphysical idea. And the physicalists say only what is physical exists, nothing else. All right? And what they mean is that, so what is it has to be something observable. And they go, well, what if it is not possible to observe this thing? There is something that is unobservable out there. And not just that we haven't observed it yet, but it's impossible to observe. If they say it's impossible to observe, then it does not exist. So that is their limits of existence. So metaphysics talks about the limits of existence. Questions about God, what is? The first questions we ask of what is the meaning of this existence? Those are all metaphysics. Another branch is called epistemology. All right? Epistemology is the study of knowledge. It comes from the Greek word epistem, which means knowledge. We ask, what does it mean to know something, and how do you know it? All right? We claim to know things all the time, like my hand is in front of my face. How do I know that? I can see it. All right? And we say, well, observation maybe is what we use to justify our knowledge. But then we may ask, well, when you observe things, are you always sure, that you're observing it correctly? For example, have you ever dreamed that your hand was in front of your face when you're really asleep? And I was like, well, maybe. And we might ask, well, how do you know you're not dreaming now? And you might be like, well, that's ridiculous. I've been awake. It's like, well, have you ever thought you were awake in a dream and thought it was real? And you might go, yeah. And then we start getting down this kind of strange trap of like, well, how do we completely 100% justify what we're doing? How can we be absolutely certain? And is certainty a part of knowledge? Do we have to be certain to know things, or can we be kind of like, I'm kind of sure? Well, that doesn't sound like knowledge if we're kind of sure. It sounds like a belief. Now, I'm not going to get any further into it. You should check out René Descartes if you want to hear anything about these questions in epistemology. But it's another great place in philosophy, and if you take my 101 class, we talk tons about epistemology. All right. Then we have what we call, some would say is value theory, which includes 2 branches, or we just throw value theory out the way and we just treat it as 2 branches. And that is ethics, okay? And then there is aesthetics. Now, ethics, we're going to kind of come back, but I'll mention what it is. It's the standards of right and wrong action, okay? why are actions right or wrong? Why is an action good, or why is an action bad or evil? Are there character traits in human beings that make them good or evil or bad or good? All right, it's the idea of what are morals. We're going to come back to that because that's what our class is about. Then aesthetics, which is related to it, okay, has to do with the standards of beauty. What makes something beautiful or ugly? It's also the ideas, what is art? What makes something artful? Why is the Mona Lisa considered art, but a scribble I do on a piece of paper not? Or maybe a scribble on a piece of paper I do is art. Or what about someone like Duchamp in the early 20th century who took a toilet seat, painted it gold, and hammered it to a museum wall and was like, it's art. Is that art? Or the idea of something like Piss Christ, right? Which, if you get a chance to look up Piss Christ at the Met Museum in New York, where a guy took a picture, a photograph of a jar, mason jar, that he peed into with a crucifix of Jesus in it. And it's very artful, a nice little filter on it. Is that art, or is that a desecration? I don't know, but aesthetics talks about art. And then finally, the fifth branch is logic, which is standards of good reasoning. And some will claim that this is, and I'm backing them on this, at least or partly on this, is that this is the most important branch of philosophy. Why? Well, every other branch depends on it. Because we don't have standards of what makes a good argument from a bad argument, then we can't determine what metaphysics are, what epistemology is, what ethics and what aesthetics are correct, right? But just to throw this out here, to be a philosopher, but you can also realize that, like, if we don't have a metaphysical position, what the understanding of the universes are, what the limits of the universe are, we can't really know what the logic of that universe is. But without a logic, we can't understand what the metaphysics are. So there's this like very circular thing that can happen in philosophy. It's a lot of fun. Or some of you might be going like, what are you talking about? It's okay. This is just the beginning, all right? Now finally, let's circle back to ethics, what this class is going to be about. All right, standards of right and wrong action, okay? So one thing you'll see that's a big difference here, unlike something like in science where you can observe something. We can see, okay, this amount of water is in this jar. We can see this car is going this fast, right? This person acted this way, right? We can say these things, but the one thing that science cannot talk about is value, how we value things. For example, if someone were to kill someone in cold blood outside a convenience store one night, let's talk about forensic science. Forensic scientists. I don't know if any of you guys like Forensic Files or any of those shows. I love those shows. The forensic scientist might show up at the scene and be able to tell you a lot of things. Like, here, this is what happened at the time of death. This is the type of weapon that was used. Maybe it was a gun. This is the direction he fired, so therefore he was this far away. Then say maybe because he was so close, he should have blood stains on him or some type of residue on him. You could say maybe it had been overnight, and we could tell by the rigor mortis in the body how long the person had died. Then we're able to maybe even go look at a camera and see the person actually did it. And we're able to catch him. Now, science can tell us all those things. These are what we call descriptive facts, all right? But the thing that we'd want to say about someone who killed someone in cold blood, or at least them or the action, is that it was wrong. That it was wrong to do this. Now, the thing is, when you shoot someone, there aren't wrong particles that fly out of them that you can see. So there's the observable wrongness. Wrongness is not something you see as in the sense like when you see, water in a jar that fills a certain line. Wrongness is a value that we're placing on an action or a person. And that can't be determined by observation. And so what we need is something like philosophy to discuss what makes something right or wrong. Why is an action right or wrong in the first place? Like, what is the authority that determines right or wrong? Is it something like a god? Is it society? Is it the law? Is there a natural law that exists? What is it that determines it? Someone would say, well, you might be very utilitarian. We'll learn what that word means this semester and say, well, that killing that person brings a lot of pain and suffering to the person as they die, but also hurts their family and all those things, which is a very logical way to think about it. But then, as a more skeptic would say, it's like, well, why does happiness of other people and the pain they feel matter? Like, why is that something that should matter? There's pain all the time. Why does pain get this special value? Now, I agree. Someone might say, well, why not? It hurts, right? But why is hurting something right or wrong, right? We'll meet another philosopher who comes along who will bring up this idea of, like, the universe doesn't care about you. The universe just is. We are just in it. And we are kind of making these things up as we go along, that we just determine that it's right or wrong because it hurts, but it doesn't mean it's really right or wrong. It's just the way we feel. Do feelings justify morality? Maybe they do. Maybe they don't. I don't know. Others will meet like the divine command theory, say, well, God gets to determine it. But then very early in the semester, we're going to talk about the Euthyphro dilemma and figure, well, even if God determined what's right or wrong, why does he have authority? Why would someone, just because they created the world, give them moral authority over it? And there may be answers to it, but we'll have to see. Ethics is like one of my favorite things to talk about, but it's also one of the most confusing. And the reason I want to say it can be confusing as we begin the semester, and this is just the beginning of it, right, is because most of us have an opinion about it already. The other 4 branches of philosophy, you might not say much about metaphysics, epistemology, logic. Maybe you don't care about art. But one thing I promise, every day you look at your phone or you turn on the TV, you see something that comes across your news feed and you go, that's just wrong. That's just right. Right? You say this all the time. You have action in the world. You judge your friends, yourself, other people, strangers. We do it all the time. We already have opinions about what's right or wrong. And which makes this the most interesting field is because we already have something about it, but what can make it confusing and the most difficult is because we have to break some of those ways that we think already down in order to begin understanding what is ethical and what isn't. All right? And so it can be tough for people. First come in, it's like, this is what I think, and then you kind of get thrown upside down. And that's the fun part. That's why this class is going to be awesome. And that just brings the final kind of lesson about philosophy I like to tell all my first-time students, is that if you're confused after this, or you get to the end of the semester and you're like, man, I know less now about ethics than I thought when I went in, then it would work right. Then it's working. One of the things that philosophy really reveals to us, it's a lot different than your science classes, your math classes, your business classes, because when you go to those classes, even if you don't like them or don't do very well, you've probably learned something more about the world. You've had something you've taken from it. What's interesting about a philosophy class is that you come in thinking you know all these things, and by the end you'll realize you really didn't know much about them in the first place. So you'll know less, but in some odd way, you've become wiser for it, because now you at least know what you didn't realize you didn't know in the first place. And that's kind of one of the best things about this course, any philosophy course in general. And you're really going to meet, when you meet Socrates, he's the first one who's going to introduce you to the idea. So it's okay that you get to the end of this and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know anything. Well, if that happened, then maybe I did my job. Okay? So that's a little intro here. I hope you guys enjoy the first week of class, and I will see you soon. Thank you very much.